And Amanda has called out our presenters who are there on your screen, Amy, Stacey, and Deborah. I am going to be monitoring in the chat. So if there are any questions or that you have, you can go ahead and place those in the chat. I will be moderating for this session, but our awesome presenters are here and I want to hand it right over to them. So over to you, colleagues.
Good morning, everyone. I am Stacey DiLiberto, and I am a lecturer in Humanities and Cultural Studies at UCF. I am joined by Debra Luken and Amy Sugar, who are both instructional designers with the Center for Distributed Learning at UCF as well. And so what we'd like to do today is share with you an activity that we created this past academic year in one of my upper division humanities courses as a way not only to build cultural literacy, but to also increase online student engagement. We created an escape room around the cultural practice or holiday El Día de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, cultural practice that you're probably familiar with that usually takes place around the time of November 1st and 2nd every year, that is very popular in both Mexican, Central American, and other Latin American countries, honoring loved ones who have passed. I want to tell you a little bit about the course first to give you a foundation before we get into some of the content considerations, as well as the technical and accessibility issues when creating this escape room. So the course that I teach, Latin American Humanities, is offered every fall semester. I've been teaching it now for the past 3 years, and I've only been teaching it as an asynchronous online class. I haven't had the opportunity yet to teach it face-to-face. So as with all the online courses that I teach, and with online courses in general, there comes several challenges that the online instructor needs to consider. Because I don't have students face-to-face, because I'm not able to gauge the temperature in the room, so to speak, it's really hard to understand whether or not students are really learning online in an asynchronous setting, and also even if they're even there, really. So as a humanities course, how can I best ensure that students not only grasp the learning outcomes of the course, but also the greater learning outcomes of humanities courses in general, which of course is to deepen appreciation for common human themes, to build empathy, and also just to share, to showcase the diversity of global human cultures, in this case, the culture of Latin America, which is vast, which diverse. It's great fun. It's one of my favorite classes to teach. So it's here, thinking about this being an online class, thinking about this being a humanities course in Latin American studies. I'm thinking a lot about non-traditional assignments, such as games, that can perhaps come in handy in order to engage students in these meaningful ways. So just a very brief background. I'm not going to, put my humanities lecturer hat on, but El Día de los Muertos is often a popular topic in general for students in Latin American humanities because they have some familiarity with it. They might have seen the Disney Pixar movie Coco. They might be familiar with sugar skulls and popular imagery that oftentimes appears on merchandise and costumes during Halloween season. And perhaps students innocently think that it is quote unquote Mexican Halloween, as perhaps many of the general population considers, especially the fact that a lot of these items are sold around the Halloween season. But we do know, and this is one of the major goals of this particular learning unit, is to dispel some of those stereotypes and to really showcase just how as a cultural practice, as a tradition that is steeped very deeply in ritual that date back to pre-Columbian times, and that is very much associated with the visual arts in Mexico, for instance, with the artwork of the 19th century artist, Jose Guadalupe Posada. this is the entry point that I have to work with sharing that information. And so just speaking casually one day with Debra, who is an instructional designer for this class, I found out that both she and Amy actually created an escape room in a face-to-face setting for their colleagues. And I thought, wait a second, here's an opportunity where we might be able to build something. So that's where the spark for this non-traditional assignment came from. So when creating this escape room, there was some pedagogical issues to consider. Firstly, we wanted to make sure that because this was a game, of course, that it would be fun, but that we wouldn't lose sight of the learning outcomes, the greater good, so to speak, of such an assignment. We wanted to ensure that the learning goals were being met, of course, in this non-traditional and fun setting. We also wanted to make sure that as a new activity, would this be a formative or summative assessment for students? We wanted to get student buy-in, and we didn't want them to feel pressured, especially thinking about this might have been their first experience with a game, in this case, an escape room. We didn't want to have too much pressure tied to that. So I decided to make this a formative assessment, one that would be simply graded on completion with student participation. So that definitely not only garnered enthusiasm because of the subject matter, but it also made it low stakes. So what I want to do now is hand the presentation over to Debra, who's going to discuss a little bit more some of the content and logistical considerations when developing this game.
Okay, thank you, Stacey. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm in kind of another room, so I just wanted to make sure everything is set up. So like Stacey talked about, so when we came together to put this activity, one of the things we didn't want to lose sight of was the main, the learning goals of this activity. So we kind of looked at different ways where with the content, we could kind of include that, historical and cultural aspect of it to the students. And so one of the best ways to kind of do that was to engage the students in the story. And because Dia de los Muertos has a lot of, rich imagery and culture and history to it, we were kind of able to sort of take that and use that idea of building the ofrenda, which is the altar to the loved ones, which is a big part of the holiday. So that's how we kind of built our story, was the puzzle, the escape room, so to speak, where they were building collecting the pieces of the ofrenda. And you'll see in these kind of two little images down here at the bottom that, once they kind of achieved a puzzle, they, got that piece of the ofrenda, and it sort of kind of kept building on. Another way that we worked to kind of create that story and engage students is we used a narrator. And so that kind of helped move the story along. So it felt more like, they were being immersed rather than just kind of a click and go and answer a quiz question and move on, get information about the history and then choose an answer. So the narrator we picked, and you can see in the skeleton, is La Calavera Catrina, which is a famous artwork from Jose Posada. And so she acts as the narrator kind of through this. So our, character sort of meets, and she kind of helps move that story along. She kind of gives the cultural and the historical and the meaning of these ofrenda items sort of, kind of throughout the puzzle, throughout the escape room, to kind of keep students. And, like I mentioned, students solved puzzles that kind of continue the story. So that helped them. So they were given some, choices, and they were, and I'll talk next sort of about some of the puzzles and things, but that led to kind of the next part of the story. So it got people kind of excited. It's like, okay, well, now I've got this ofrenda item. And so, they were learning through that. And it's very possible that a story may already exist in the content. And this was a great example of that, because there is a lot of, excuse me, there's a lot of, historical reference. So the next thing that as far as the content consideration goes, is enhancing it with image. And so, of course, again, we were lucky with this particular topic. There's a lot of great colorful imagery and history and things. So we were able to take some of those pieces to use it with the story and kind of tell that story along with it. So it kind of meshed with our objective was learning about this holiday and the cultural. And so we were able to take that and put that together. Fortunately, we have a graphic designer in CDL that was able to create some of these great sort of custom graphics for us. And so these down here are the pieces of the ofrenda items that they collect, and they each have a specific meaning within the holiday and things in the culture and the history. And so when they get to the end, like I said, they kind of collect these pieces all the way. And so when they get to the end, they sort of get this little, animated gift celebration that they, escaped, so to speak. And so that was a great way, because since we were able to have these created, we were able to keep those images sort of, consistent, and the colors and things to kind of make it still feel like they're immersed in the story and not just, clicking through reading things. And then we also used certain parts and images as part of the puzzles. And so there's a lot of great, if you don't have a graphic designer, there's a lot of great resources out there that you can kind of get images, but you want to think about when you're enhancing with images and your story that they relate, to your story and your content. So the next thing we'll talk about with content is building the puzzles. And to me, that was the most fun part because I'm a puzzle person, so I like that. But the biggest thing was to kind of practice your puzzles. Go online and play puzzles. There are a lot of resources for online escape rooms. And so you can kind of go through them easily and see, if there's puzzles that you can kind of adapt to your story or adapt to your content. And again, with that, you want to relate those puzzles to the story. So this is a kind of an example, like here we have the recipe for the pan de muerta, which is the bread part of the ofrenda that, well, I had gotten the idea from those, you've seen those online, sort of those icon kind of math puzzles. And I was like, okay, well, that's kind of a neat puzzle, but how can I relate that back to our story and relate that to our content? So I did some kind of research about imagery, and I found these sort of like Aztec symbols, part of the historical aspect of the content. And so I was like, okay, well, what if we had our fantastic graphic designer sort of, do this kind of with a recipe that we had found for the bread. So that's kind of how those puzzles are relating to that content in the story. And the same thing with this Papel Picado banner. It's a little small, but so basically they're kind of tracing their way, like they're sort of cutting out the Papel Picado, which is a big part of the band. You see a lot of those banners and things around, and there's a lot of history and skill and artistry with creating these banners. So that's where we got, kind of adapted sort of a maze puzzle to relating to the content. And when it comes to puzzles, you want to start off fairly easy. So we kind of started with a very simple kind of, we gave students a little bit of a choice to kind of, do they go into the basement or not? You want to be careful sometimes with those types of choice and choose your own adventure, because it can get kind of overwhelming. So eventually, they did kind of come back, and the puzzles we did were sort of very kind of linear. It wasn't, all the way around, just a little bit, so we could kind of keep track of it. And again, starting simple with things, but you want to also vary the types of puzzles and the complexity of the puzzles. There's kind of a sweet spot. You don't want it too easy that they're like, that players or students, get bored with it, but you don't want it too hard that they get frustrated with it. So you kind of want to mix up the different types of puzzles. And so we had some different ones, again, like this maze puzzle. We had kind of some sort of simpler, like, they had to pick out the photograph, which one was Jose Posada. And then we had the Calavera Katrina, our narrator, give some riddles and kind of that they sort of had to answer, and then, choose what the correct thing was. So we definitely wanted to again, mixing up those puzzles, but relating them to the content. So once you have your, your content and things that you want to start thinking about the logistics of your puzzle or the escape room. And so like our fabulous keynote presenter this morning, think big, start small. So we just focused on one activity in the course. We didn't try to gamify the entire course. We just, we picked one thing and we thought, okay, well, this Dia de los Muertos, there's a lot of content and things that we can kind of use for this. The next thing is to play test, and that's practice and send, your puzzles and your activity to people, because people are going to react differently to different types of puzzles. We had one puzzle that we kind of did that, I would say probably the least successful of the puzzles. And it was one that they were given kind of a document, and then they were given a code, and they spelled out, they were given lines and page numbers to kind of spell out a word to solve. And so that was probably the least successful of the puzzle. But I'm thinking like, okay, well, that's probably one of the easiest puzzles. So you want to kind of practice, and you want to have, beta test things and send things out, to people and see what they think and get feedback on how you can. And again, you'll think about some of those technology and accessibility issues. So we also want to think about the logistics of the activity. So where are you going to put it in the course? How long is this going to take students? Is this a solo activity or a group activity? So we opted to do this as an asynchronous activity. So the students kind of went on their own to do it. It fit in with the timing of Stacey's course, because right around the time of the holiday was when, she was kind of teaching this topic. So it kind of fit right. It wasn't like we were trying to teach this towards Christmas. We were, actually in that so they could kind of see it and get a lot of outside kind of input from that. So, and again, you want to think about, like Stacey had mentioned, again, how are you scoring it? How are you kind of grading it? Is it something, that is high, you don't want something starting out like this to be something high stakes. You don't want students to be kind of stressed out, because you want this to be a fun activity, and you want them to get out of it what you're building it for. And so also you want to provide students with kind of feedback, and that's what we did with some of the questions, was if they couldn't get the answer correct or they stumbled. So we kind of built some of that in. And so now we've got Amy, who will be talking about some of those technology and accessibility considerations that we built into this.
Thank you, Debra. And Debra, if you could just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Yep, I can.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I came into this project since I focus on accessibility as one of my research areas. So I worked with Stacey and Debra as we looked at the different technology tools that we could use for this escape room and test them out. So of course, with any game that we're using for a course, we first want to start with the pedagogical goals. And as Debra just mentioned, we want to look at those logistical needs as well. So I'm just going to really quickly walk you through our process for selecting the technology. We started by looking at internal tools that we have access to at UCF. But we weren't able to find a tool that would allow us to embed all of those images that Debra had mentioned earlier. So we also looked at some external tools. We ended up using Google Forms because it's very easy to use. We could embed our images, and it's also free to students. So cost is something really important to consider, as well as usability. So as I mentioned, I was the one who really focused on the accessibility of this and determined creative ways that we could address any accessibility issues, especially since this was an asynchronous activity that students were doing on their own. And as Debra mentioned, the tracking and grading were really important. This was a required assignment for students to complete in Stacey's course. And so I have a couple of screenshots on the right side of my slide. And you'll see where the top screenshot shows that nice graphic. We were able to embed those graphics into that Google form. But if you're not familiar with Google Forms, it's really nice because you can build your questions very easily. And so the questions basically were the storyline and the puzzles. And then the bottom screenshot, I put a box around the responses tab. Google Forms allows you to see a spreadsheet view of all of the responses. And then also Stacey could easily download that spreadsheet and then use that to input the grades into her course. So I'm going to go on. Debra will go on and talk about accessibility considerations now. So I'm just going to delve a little bit deeper into this. So as I mentioned, of course, we want to proactively think about accessibility and usability as we're designing these games. And so it's really important to first make sure you're familiar with accessibility best practices and then apply those to the technology tool that you're using. So, you know, when we were looking at Google Forms, it was interesting because there wasn't an alt text option. And so after doing some research, we learned that they actually have a similar feature. It's called hover text. And when you add hover text, it actually displays the text on the screen so everyone can see it. So that's good because it's describing that image. It doesn't hurt for everyone to see it. However, that hover text wouldn't work for a lot of these puzzles that Debra had designed. So, so we came up with some creative ways. One example is the image on the top right of the screen. One of the puzzles that we created, the students had to select the correct color pattern of the candles. And so if you notice, if you can see in that screenshot, for the options and the answer choices, we just went ahead and put the text of those color patterns so they could read the text of those colors, they could look at the picture, they could do both. So a little bit of universal design applied here as well. And then the image on the bottom right, I think as Debra showed that earlier, she had this really neat long graphic created for this recipe for pan de muertos. And that had way too much, you know, symbols and too much information to use as alt text or hover text. So we simply created a page and Debra creatively wrote out a text alternative for all that information. And then we just linked to that page. So if anyone needed the text alternative, they would have access to that. So, you know, just thinking through what are the alternatives. Sometimes the technology may limit you with some of the accessibility things, but you can find creative solutions to address those most of the time. And the last thing I just wanted to mention for accessibility and usability is one thing you can do. We saw some really neat examples with puzzles where you can embed hints for the learners in the puzzles so they can get feedback to maybe help them out. But one thing that Stacey did is she put an asynchronous discussion board in her course as an optional help. So if students wanted to go there to share, hey, I'm stuck on this puzzle, or if they wanted to collaborate, she built that into her course to support students. So I'm going to pass it back over to Stacey, and she's going to share some student feedback with us.
Thank you, Amy. So as with all new activities where you're trying to gauge student feedback, we employed a survey at the end of the activity just to gauge, firstly, whether or not students gained a deeper understanding about the Day of the Dead, whether or not they increased that cultural literacy. But we, of course, also wanted to gauge their perceptions regarding the activity itself, because we certainly want to revise it and try it again. So what you see on this screen are the questions, the survey questions that we provided to students in a Likert scale using Qualtrics. Out of 35 students in the class, about 70% of the class participated in this optional survey, which we believe was a great turnout, given the fact that, of course, it was optional. It was nice to know that students were encouraged to share their perspectives and that they wanted to help me out, because I mentioned that in an announcement that I said they would be helping us greatly if they provided us with some of that feedback. So the first question was tied directly to the learning outcome of the lesson, and then the rest of the questions are more of those qualitative types of questions on whether or not they like the activity, would they want to complete another type of activity, and whether or not, as opposed to traditional types of assignments, readings, discussions, etc., if they like this as an alternative. So on the next slide, you will see a graph representation of the student responses. And as you can see, overwhelmingly for all 4 questions, there was a strongly agree perception. And that was actually something not only surprising, but I know Amy, Debra, and I were quite encouraged by it. We only see see one strongly disagree on question number 4 regarding whether or not the student would want to complete another escape room. So at least for myself, I thought it was great. And this was a great victory in the sense that not only did students participate, they liked it and they actually wanted to do it again. I've included on the following slide some actual written responses from the students themselves. We provided the opportunity for students to comment, to actually write, short narratives on the survey as well. So as you can see, just from these 4 different blurbs, these 4 different quotes that I've included, there was really some overwhelmingly positive comments. And, these are just some of the few that were shared, but that seemed to be a recurring theme for those comments. Some that I didn't include were, students really loved the storyline. They'd actually love to see that storyline narrated through audio. One student even said that they loved it so much that they wish they had more puzzles, that they wish it was harder, that they just kept wanting to do it, which was very encouraging. So when considering next steps, as well as ways to revise the escape room, because we want to build on what we have this great student feedback moving forward. So we're definitely going to go back and look at some of the puzzles and think about ways that they could be reconfigured, perhaps provide them with different hints, some better hints. I know students struggled particularly with one particular puzzle, and we'll be revising that one. We're considering for sure potentially including a narrated audio, maybe giving a voice to the narrator of La Calavera Katrina, and I've already volunteered to be that narrator. I mean, I'm actually really excited about that. So we'll see how that goes. To incorporate more images, to maybe actually incorporate the images of the narrator throughout the puzzle, so it actually that adds to that immersive effect that you're going along this journey with the narrator. But overall, we think that it was a great success. I know from an instructor perspective, it was something that was really encouraging. And not only did I have fun collaborating with my colleagues to create it, but I'm so happy that the students had fun as well. So we're hoping to deploy this activity once again in fall 2023, and we'll see how it goes. So thank you so much for your attention. We're certainly happy to take any questions, but our contact information is on the screen as well.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing the process, especially the content considerations and accessibility matters for this.
I will also, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to